The subjects of poverty and inequality are often scrambled together in public discussions, but they aren't at all the same thing. As discussed in the previous lecture, poverty refers to those who are below a certain level of income. Inequality, on the other hand, describes the gap between the poor and the rich. Imagine, for example, that the rich get much richer while the poor get a little richer. Then inequality might go up because the spread between the poor and the rich is rising, but the poverty rate could be going down at the same time. Or imagine that the poor do a little bit worse and the rich do a lot worse. In that situation, poverty could increase because the poor are doing worse at the same time that inequality, the gap between rich and poor, is falling. And at a fundamental level, we care about poverty and inequality for somewhat different reasons. At a basic level, we care about poverty because some people are being deprived of basic necessities. I would say that we care about inequality for reasons that have more to do with a sense of fairness of opportunity, a sense that it would be a good thing to live in a society where the rewards and the disparities are not just distributed by birth or by luck or by family connections, but they have at least some connection to producing what the rest of society wants. Well, how do we measure inequality? We need some way of capturing the entire distribution of income, not just the low end of it. A standard approach is to split the income distribution into parts, like fifths or tenths or even single percents, and then say what share of income is being received by each share of the income distribution. Now, for simplicity, in this lecture, I'll mainly stick with dividing up the income distribution into fifths, with some mention of the top 5%. The level of inequality in the U.S. income distribution can be measured by looking at the share of income received by different quintiles, or different fifths. If each fifth of the U.S. income distribution got exactly 20% of total income, then income would be equally distributed. If the bottom 20% got 20% of the income, the middle 20%, the next 20%, the fourth 20%, the top 20%. But in fact, of course, the bottom fifth gets a lot less than 20% of total income, and the top fifth gets a lot more. In fact, starting in the 1970s, there's something of a trend toward those with high incomes having a larger proportion of all total income. Now, just to give you some perspective here, the top fifth of all families in the year 2000 started at about $95,000 in total income and went up from there. So today it's probably some number above $100,000, but not necessarily a whole lot above. So let me give you some actual numbers on the income distribution. In 2002, the bottom fifth of the income distribution got 4.2% of total income. The second fifth got 9.7% of total income. The middle fifth, the middle quintile of the income distribution, got 15.5% of total income. The fourth fifth got 23% of total income. And the top fifth, the top 20% of the income distribution, got 47.6% of the income. If you look inside that top fifth a little bit, then you just look at the top 5% of the income distribution. In 2002, the top 5% of the income distribution got about 20.8% of the total income in the economy. Over time, that distribution, the spread between the bottom fifth and the top fifth, has actually been rising somewhat over time. For example, if you go back to 1975, the top fifth of the income distribution at that point was getting 40.7% of total income. So it goes from 40.7% of total income, then by 1985 up to 43.1% of total income. By 1995, up to 46.5% of total income. By 2000, up to 47.7% of total income, right about where it was in 2002 after the recession. To put it a little bit differently, the top fifth of the income distribution was getting 40.7% of the income distribution back in 1975, and by 2002, it was getting 7 percentage points more. It was getting 47.6% of total income by 2002. That's quite a large shift. If you look at a more detailed breakdown, and you particularly focus on that top 5%, almost all of that increase going to the top fifth of the income distribution was actually going to the top 5% of the income distribution. And for perspective, the top 5% of all families in the U.S. in 2002 started at about $164,000 and went up from there. So now it's a few years later. I suspect it's some number that's less than $200,000, but maybe not extremely a whole lot less than $200,000 a year. So that's the level of inequality we've got. And we know that the level of inequality as measured by these quintiles has been going up. Is that a bad thing? Well, some degree of inequality is surely understandable. There's absolutely no reason to think that we ought to have an economy where everyone gets exactly the same income all through their life. For example, most people, when you first start out working in your 20s or in your teens, you have a somewhat lower income. Then you build up your income over time in middle age, have high income years in your 40s and 50s, and then when you're elderly and you start going to part-time work or retirement, then you have lower income. There's no reason you should have the same income every year of your life. Even year to year, there are shifts between rich and poor. People might have an especially good year and especially bad year. In some industries like construction or farming or people who write books or record music, they'll have good and bad years. There are also people who make earning money a top priority in their life, and others do not. There are friends of mine who worked for a time in investment banks in New York City, and I'm thinking particularly of the hot go-go days of the late 1990s there. But I remember at least one of them telling me that her standard schedule was that she worked straight through the night a couple times a week. I mean, she would show up in the morning at Monday morning, and she would go home Tuesday night, get a night's sleep, come back Thursday morning, and work through the night and leave Friday night. Now, this person made an extremely high income level, much more than my income level, but obviously at some cost in terms of time. She's probably working the equivalent of 2 jobs in terms of hours. And there are people who work 2 jobs, and there are other people who don't. There's some people who would prefer to have a job where they earn enough money to afford a house and so on, but they would rather stay home and read than buy an expensive vehicle or a boat. There's some people who like to travel cheap, and there's some people who like to travel in luxury hotels. There's some people who want a huge house and car, and there's some people who don't. To some extent, inequality in incomes is just going to result from these kinds of preferences. So we know that perfect equality just isn't going to be a sensible goal. There's going to be some inequality because people are different. And with all this taken into account, is the level of inequality we have now reasonable or not? Perhaps not a big surprise. These are lectures about how to think about things. I'm going to sidestep that question a little bit. A famous economist from the University of Chicago named Henry Simons was talking about inequality, and he wrote back in 1938 that the case against inequality depends on the ethical or aesthetic judgment that the prevailing distribution of wealth and income reveals a degree and or kind of inequality which is distinctly evil or unlovely. That phrase about evil or unlovely and whether it's an aesthetic judgment is something that's echoed down among economists over time. In fact, I find that there's an almost inability of people on both sides of inequality disputes to even understand the way the other people think. In some cases, some folks are just upset about the level of inequality they see. It just bugs them. It bugs them down to their toes. And if you say, well, it doesn't bother me that much, they think that you're not telling the truth somehow because it's obvious. Isn't it obvious that it's a terrible thing? Isn't it obvious that it ought to bug you? And on the other side, there are people who say, well, it doesn't bother me all that much, and they just honestly can't understand why people on the other side get so excited about it. Sort of like, what makes you so excited about the level of inequality that's happening? So I think that we need to recognize that people just have different aesthetic judgments there. What about the question of mobility across the income distribution? The income distribution at any given time is a snapshot. It tells you how people are located along the income distribution, but it doesn't tell you about how people are moving toward higher and lower levels. if there's a lot of movement from lower quintiles to higher quintiles and higher quintiles to lower quintiles, then maybe you worry somewhat less about income distribution, because sort of everyone gets their chance at the top, everyone gets their chance at the bottom. Now, to know whether there is movement from people between the quintiles, you need to track the same people over a long period of time. Most government surveys don't do this. They just look at the population, but they don't tell you, did that person go up or down according to where they do last year? However, there is a survey project at the University of Michigan called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And starting in 1968, it started tracking a nationally represented group. And it's been tracking those people and their children and their relatives, and it tracks people after they split up after divorce. And so you can actually track people over time and watch people move in and out of different quintiles as they get older, as they move in and out of the workforce, as their life patterns change. The patterns that you see looking at this PSID data from the University of Michigan are pretty much what you might expect. That is, there's a fair amount of movement, but it tends to be moving maybe 1 or 2 quintiles. People who are at the very bottom of the income distribution move up a little bit, but they don't always move right to the top. And similarly, people at the very top of the income distribution might move down a little bit, but rarely do they fall all the way down to the bottom. But here's my key point, really. The amount of mobility between quintiles doesn't seem to have changed much over time. It seems much the same in the 2000s and 1990s as it did in the 1980s and 1970s. So, although we know for sure that the level of inequality has been rising, and we know there's some mobility, we also know that the higher level of inequality is not being counterbalanced by a greater level of mobility. So mobility isn't making us worry less about the rise in inequality than it otherwise would. Indeed, in a world where the skills of labor are especially and increasingly important, the pattern may be that high-income parents have the human and the financial resources to invest in their children in a way that helps their children to have higher incomes too. In that sense, it may be easier than it was in the past to pass a high income to the next generation because of the importance of investing in children as they grow up. There are international comparisons where they look at intergenerational mobility. That is, do children tend to follow the income pattern of their parents? And the answer seems to be, in the last 30 years or so, that the US does not have more intergenerational mobility than most countries of Western Europe. Indeed, there are several studies that suggest that the US has less intergenerational mobility than either Canada or Sweden. So there's less of people moving back and forth across the income distribution than in those other countries. So bottom line, inequality is up, mobility is not up, and if you're worried about inequality, if it's an aesthetic thing that bothers you, there's certainly some reason to be concerned. And I'll dip my toe in the water there and just say that the rise in inequality does bother me. Having some inequality doesn't, but a continual rise does bother me. So, what are the reasons for this rise in inequality? We need to look for reasons that have been more or less continuously happening over the last several decades, because the rise in inequality started in the 1970s and has continued for the last 30 years. So it can't be something that just one president did or one law that passed. It has to be a continuous force over time. We also want to look for reasons that might apply internationally, because to some extent we've seen an increase in inequality in most of the world's high-income economies. And so we want something that goes across international borders. And again, not something that's one law passed by the US Congress or something like that. The single biggest reason for the rise in inequality appears to be the changes in information and communications technology that have been happening over recent decades. Essentially, those changes have complemented or worked with the productivity of high-skilled workers. The way I sort of imagine this in my mind is, sort of imagine that there's a level of demand for high-skilled workers and a level of supply for these high-skilled workers. Now, the supply of skilled workers is expanding over time because today's students are more likely to complete high school and then to go on to at least some college than the older workers who are retiring were likely to go on and do some college 40 or 50 years ago. So the supply of these skilled workers is going up. However, the changes in information and communications technology, including the just phenomenal developments in computers and the internet, have dramatically increased the demand for high-skilled labor. So the supply of skilled labor has gone up some, but the demand for skilled labor has been going up faster and faster and faster. I mean, it used to be, for example, that in lots and lots of companies there were middle-level managers who collected information from a sales force and they wrote reports. And then they essentially, handed those reports up the chain to other managers who read the reports. There were lots of people in organizations whose job was to file shipping invoices and accounts receivable things and deal with payroll checks and inventory and all the sorts of nuts and bolts. And those people had managers and departments, and there was a whole hierarchy of them. But a manager who is skilled in the use of information and communications technology can now essentially compile that kind of information and oversee a lot of those processes without all those middle managers, without all those people. If you want to look at over a sales force, for example, you don't have to have someone go and collect all the information from the people in the sales force and write you up a thick report. All you need to do is hit the computer, and the good computer software will spit out for you a graph, trend lines, whatever you want to see about what happened for all those salesmen that you're overseeing. You don't need the middle managers to look at that stuff anymore. So the result of these changes in technology has been much higher productivity for this group of highly skilled, highly placed workers. And conversely, at the other end of the wage scale, many lower skilled jobs, like being a file clerk, have largely disappeared. I mean, I worked my way through college in the late 70s and early 80s in the summers, working as someone in a company who put things in files and put the files in drawers. I somehow don't think they have 4 people doing that job anymore. So, in short, the demand for high-skilled labor increased faster than the supply. The productivity of high-skilled workers was able to go way up, and it drove up the wages for that high-skilled labor. This theory also suggests that in the future, inequality could swing back in the other direction, as more and more people get accustomed to computer and information technology, and as it becomes more widespread and widely used across the economy. So, the main cause of the rise in inequality is technology, but there are some other causes too. Another underlying cause often mentioned is the increase in foreign trade, which is sometimes called globalization. U.S. workers are having to compete more directly with workers from other countries like Mexico and China and India, where wages can be much lower. Now, U.S. workers are far more productive than workers in those countries. They're more educated, they have more physical capital, they're working in an economy with better infrastructure or usually better management, and so U.S. workers are worth much more pay. But still, competing with people in low-wage economies can have some impact. By some estimates, some economic studies, maybe 1/5 or so of the growth in inequality is due to the pressure of globalization on wages. But this is a little bit controversial because some people would say, what is globalization? Globalization is really new technology as well. It's reaching around the world with the internet and with different connections to be able to manage all of those enterprises all around the world. Yet another cause of inequality are institutions in the U.S. labor market. And we've seen a number of changes in recent decades that have tended to add to inequality. 2 in particular. One is minimum wages. Minimum wages were higher in the 1960s and 1970s than they are today, adjusted for inflation. For example, if you look at the minimum wage in 1981, it was at that time $3.35 an hour. But if you adjust for inflation since then, it would be about $7 an hour in 2005. The actual minimum wage in 2005 is $5.15 an hour. So the minimum wage hasn't grown relative to inflation to keep up with what's happened in the rest of the economy. Now again, I'm not saying here the first thing we ought to do is raise the minimum wage to $7 an hour or $10 or $12 an hour. As we talked about in earlier lectures, if you push a minimum wage too high, you can discourage hiring. But it is true that historically, the minimum wage has had the effect of pushing up wages for workers at the bottom of the wage distribution. Another important labor market institution, the second cause here, is unions. Back in the early 1950s, about 1/3 of the U.S. workforce belonged to a union. By the mid-2000s, about 13% of all U.S. workers are in a union. And if you leave out public sector unions, the teachers' unions, only about 8% of private sector workers are in a union. Now, again, I don't mean this to be an unconditional endorsement of more unions. Unions are complicated. As we talked about before, they can work better or worse. But it is true that unions have historically tended to encourage a more equal distribution of income. And so the weakness of unions tends to lead to a greater level of inequality. It's also true that if you look at household incomes, those have become more unequal because of changes in family patterns. Specifically, the rise in single-parent families and the rise of high-earner couples marrying each other. The proportion of families with single parent and children has gone up over time. In 1968, about 10% of all children lived in a household with a mother and no father. 10% of all children. By 1996, 23% of all children lived in a household with a mother and no father. And it stayed at that level, dipped a little bit into the mid-2000s. It's now more common also to have two high-income earners marry each other. You know, two men, a man and woman, both doctors or both lawyers, marry and then they both continue to work. The pattern in the old sort of gender-segregated workplace was that the high-earning spouse, usually the man, would marry a woman with a lower earning path. The lawyer would marry a secretary, the doctor would marry a nurse, and often the woman would then drop out of the labor force. And so this process of high-income earners marrying each other has tended to push up the inequality that we observe among households. What public policies are available to reduce inequality? Well, one obvious choice would be high taxes on the rich. If we tax the rich a lot, we can certainly reduce their incomes and diminish inequality in that way. But it's interesting, the share of federal taxes paid by those with high incomes is actually relatively high by the standards of recent decades in the early 2000s. Let me cite you some numbers from a Congressional Budget Office study. If you look at the top quintile of earners, back in 1980, those folks they paid 56.3% of all federal taxes. And of all federal taxes, I mean here to include not only income tax, but payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, excise taxes, even the corporate income tax is sort of attributed back to people in the economy. So in this calculation, we're looking at all the federal taxes and who pays them. 1980, the top quintile of income paid 56.3% of all the taxes. By 1990, that was up a little bit, to 57.9% of all taxes. By 1995, the top quintile was paying 61.9% of all federal taxes. By 2000, the top quintile was paying 66.7% of all federal taxes. And that dropped off a little bit by 2002 after the tax cuts in 2001, and it was 64.8% of all taxes were paid by the top 20% at that point. If you look at just the top 5%, the top 5% of the income distribution was paying 37.3% of all federal taxes as of 2002. Now, I'm not against the rich paying more, but it's a fair point to say that compared to, say, the 1980s and the Reagan years, they are paying more. They are paying a larger share of federal taxes. Now, again, one might argue, well, it should be still higher, and that's a fair enough argument, but it wouldn't be right to say that they're paying a historically low share of taxes. It's also worth remembering that not all of the rich folks in this top quintile are multimillionaires. Remember, the top 20% kicks in with families with an income of about $100,000 a year. So that's obviously good money, but it's not millionaire level. So when we think about whether or not we should tax the rich more, what we really need to sort of carry in our minds is that might be a good idea, but compared to the standard of the last few decades, we actually are taxing those with high incomes at a relatively high level, in the sense that they're paying a fairly large share of the existing federal taxes. The question of whether to push even harder and have the rich pay an even larger share of federal taxes essentially, I think, takes us back to Henry Simon's statement about whether you find the current proportions unlovely or not. Some people say, I just can't believe that we don't have the rich pay more taxes, and some say, well, that percentage looks about right. What if we sort of get beyond taxes and try and think about alternative methods for reducing inequality? If we got away from the tax side, we could look at the government spending side. For example, we could think about increasing government spending in a way that especially benefited those with low and middle-level incomes. Distributing more money to the poor in whatever form will reduce inequality. But, as we talked about in the previous lecture, there are going to be some important issues here about the effect of such redistributions on incentives to work, and on whether such redistributions are a band-aid that really doesn't address the underlying social problems of perhaps bad education levels or families that are not passing along good skills to their kids. One proposal has been to dramatically expand the earned income tax credit that we talked about in the previous lecture. Basically, the idea would be that if someone is working full-time, then we should make sure they earn a decent wage. We won't force firms to pay more by raising the minimum wage a whole lot, because we don't want to create a situation where we're discouraging firms from hiring these folks. But, for example, let's say that you've got a relatively low wage job, you're making $8 an hour, so working 2,000 hours a year, that works out to $16,000 a year. Could we expand the earned income tax credit by enough so that you would make $24,000 a year, the equivalent of $12 an hour instead? Now, a really aggressive plan like that could be extremely costly. Like, it might cost tens of billions of dollars, depending on how it was structured. But a plan like that could also be a powerful reward for working that might really pay large social dividends in terms of family stability and reductions in certain kinds of social problems. Also, government spending doesn't have to be a direct cash payment to families that are poor in order to have a disproportionate effect of helping folks with lower incomes. You could imagine, for example, expanded spending on public schools or on school lunches. In cities where geography favors it, you could think about expanding mass transit, which tends to be ridden more by families with lower incomes. You could imagine better public safety protection, more police in low-income areas. You could imagine more resources committed to public areas, spaces like libraries, parks, schools, maybe having schools open in the evenings, community centers, even things like making post offices into safe places where you could have automatic teller machines. So all those kinds of steps wouldn't distribute income directly to those with low and middle incomes, but they would expand the safeness and the security of public spaces and public resources, which then those folks could rely on. Yet another way of reducing inequality would be to strengthen the labor market institutions that lead to more equal wages. For example, we could pass laws that would make it somewhat easier for workers to vote to join a union. Right now there are these big disputes between management and labor. The laws could be changed in a way that would make it a little bit easier to join a union. Or you could raise the minimum wage at least a little bit. Now, again, I'm not saying that these steps, more unions, higher minimum wage, are without trade-offs or costs. But if your specific goal is to reduce inequality, if that's the goal you have in mind, then those steps probably would help that goal. And of course, another thing that would probably help reduce inequality would be to aggressively fight against the remaining elements of racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination wherever they're occurring in the economy. Final step toward assuring inequality could be reduced and that equality could be a greater value is to think about the ladder of opportunity that people face in the U.S. society. For example, if we could assure that each child born in the United States gets a fair start in life, and by a fair start, I mean things including but not limited to good education, decent health care, decent nutrition, then I think that much of the concern over inequality would be somewhat diminished. Now, of course, almost everyone in theory is in favor of, good education and good health care and good nutrition for children. But there are difficult issues about how to do it and what the cost might be and what the potential interference would be with parents and families. In this world we live in, the chances are that we aren't ever going to have exactly identical equal opportunities for all people out there in the economy. I mean, for one thing, some children are just going to have better parents than others, better, more involved parents who read more stories, take them more places. And at the end of the day, that's going to be a very tough difference for any social policy to overcome. But it's also true that part of the American dream, part of the American ethos, is that everyone should have a good, solid chance of success. And that those who go through a public school education and who work full-time and do their best with the hand they're dealt, that all of those people should have a good chance at a reasonable, successful, middle-class kind of life. If we could work on the ladder of opportunity and make sure it really existed for everyone, then my guess is that concerns over inequality would be quite a bit diminished.